we're going to move swiftly on to Sean Holm. Sean is a former student of mine from Swansea University who's currently wrapping up his PhD, but he is also a representative on the QAA board as a postgraduate representative. He's literally just come from a meeting where they have been discussing AI. So we are getting information hot off the press from the QAA. So Sean, over to you.
Okay, so Nigel asked me to come over and give a little bit of a talk about artificial AI in education, partially from a student's perspective, some of the perspectives that I might be able to bring from it, and partially from a QAA perspective as well. So a little bit of background myself. As Nigel said, I was previously a student of his at Swansea University as an undergraduate. I then stayed to do a PhD. I'm just in the processes of really finishing and writing that up, and I've now started working as a lecturer for a short while there as well. So I guess I kind of have a viewpoint of very recently having been an undergraduate, a postgraduate, and now also on the flip side of that, teaching and marking as well. So hopefully that's a good viewpoint to have on this. So I thought I'd just start with a little bit of a historical perspective on this. So I find this quite amusing, but really a long time ago, this was, well, over the history, it's been lots of developments of new technologies coming in, and they've often always been critiqued in wider society and education with fears that they may disrupt the system. Students aren't going to learn anything anymore. They're just going to use these new tools. And in particular, way back when Plato was busy writing one of his dialogues, he, through the mouth of Socrates, critiques the written word, saying it would essentially make people forgetful. So I'll just read a quick quote from this. So, who are you, fathers of letters, have been led by your affection to ascribe them a power, the opposite of that which they really possess. For this intervention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, produced by external characters which are not part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You have invented an elixir not of memory, but of reminding. So it seems that Plato was pretty upset about the whole idea of books, but rather ironically, he was writing this down in a book as well. So he understood that this new technology had a real significant power, and it was really important to use it properly as well. So similar remarks have been made throughout history with new technologies, creating, accessing and sharing information have been developed, such as printing press, or really modern with technologies. So another great example of that is the adoption of computers and schools in the workplace when they first became really mainstream, and there was a wave of what they called computer phobia. So you could see lots of this word suddenly appearing in the press at the time, in journals, in magazines, and it was a really big thing. Lots of people in the workplace just would not want to have computers, or in schools would not want to have computers there because it was different, it was new, it was going to make the students forget how to write properly, it was going to make them lose all these skills. But now they've become quite an integral part of our daily lives, and I couldn't imagine going around without my computer these days. It's got all the information on that I need for everything. Although, to be fair, actually, as an undergraduate, I didn't use a laptop. I was a solid pen and paper kind of notes taker. But as I moved into PGR, I realized that I really did need something else to make all my notes because they became incredibly messy. So these are tools that help us speed up our work and make us a lot more productive. The same can be said for the internet. There are many fears that students may be accessing material that is really of poor quality, they're not developing critical thinking skills, and although these remain risks, proper education around how to use these tools, how to use the internet, how to access quality information, how to assess that information, have made them really powerful educational tools. It's certainly much quicker to hop online, search a journal for some information that I'm interested in learning about and writing about, than having to scroll through a library catalogue, hope that they have that particular journal in, or if not, then have to order it in so that I could then read it. So, we've developed these tools to help us be much more productive. So we'll do the same with generative AI. Despite the critiques that are currently in place, I think that in the very near future, we're all going to be using it a lot more, and it will quite quickly integrate into our daily routines and daily learning processes. So whether we realize it or not, AI is already all around us. It's in our daily lives. So making this PowerPoint, I have actually been using AI as well. It's very simple parts of it. So for example, whilst writing, I make a lot of spelling mistakes. We all do punctuation, grammar errors, and thankfully the AI systems built into the Word part of PowerPoint is able to pick up those spelling errors, or typos, missing grammar, double capital letters, forgetting capital letters, and so it highlights that for me, so I can quickly edit that and improve the quality of my work. So it's already there, it's already in use, and we're all using it. It's already around us in speech-to-text technologies. It's quite easy to make notes sometimes just by simply talking to my phone, and it will write it down quite quickly, way faster than I could possibly type it. And I think that most of us would agree these are really, really useful tools. It's translation tools as well, really, really helpful, and they've made our work easier and faster. Another fantastic suite of tools that use AI are image-based ones. I love being able to search images. That's been really, really helpful. Be able to put in prompts and bring up images related to that particular kind of prompt. These all are tools that are speeding up our approach to how we do our work. So it's really time-saving tools, and we've all become quite used to using them. They're integral parts of many parts of our economy as well, keeping us safe from frauds in our banking. That fraud detection thing, sometimes when it suddenly says, "Are you sure you made this purchase?" is based off of AI models of what it thinks you like to buy and when you buy things and how much you spend on things. But then moving into something, I guess, slightly more controversial, we have the fact that AI is used to feed us information that it thinks we might like. So these are those infamous algorithms that are also getting a lot of press at the minute. So whenever we search something on Google, or we hop onto YouTube, Twitter, anywhere where we're going for our information, our news outlets, what we see, what comes up to us, is really dictated by a very sophisticated algorithm that is supplemented by AI as well. And this, I guess, has some implications very similar to current generative AI models such as ChatGPT, in the fact that this model dictates what information we end up seeing when we use these tools and resources. So it's already in the mindset of students and educators, I hope, that these types of models, whilst they can be really useful, help us get information really quickly, they also have pretty bad biases in them, and they dictate what kind of information we see. So we really need to keep that in mind when we are using these tools. So I think one of the worst things that we can do in response to that, though, is have that knee-jerk reaction and attempt an outright ban of these kinds of tools. It's probably, well, not going to be very effective in any way, shape, or form. Very hard to enforce. Instead, we need to learn how to harness these tools and use them for a greater good. And the conversations that we've been having in the QAA recently really seem to be taking this on as the best approach. And we're kind of, at the QAA, really working on listening to what everybody is trying to do in the field. At the moment, it is fairly sort of disparate. Everybody is playing around with the different approaches, trying to see what works best, how to educate people in using these tools, what are the best practices, and really trying to bring that all together still at this point in time. So we're also really interested to hear how people in different institutions are using these tools, how they're regulating these tools, and how they're teaching students and staff about how to use them effectively and the risks and dangers involved. Okay, so living with AI, we're living with AI whether we would like it or not, and that's not really going to change. So in a recent webinar by the QAA titled "To Ban or Not to Ban," I think it became very clear that the whole purpose of, the whole point is it's kind of impossible to ban, like I said earlier. It's not going to be a very feasible idea. It's probably not a very good idea. and it may end up hurting students in the long run. So we have to embrace it. In my opinion, there are a couple of areas that need to be addressed in our approach to a post-generative AI world. The first big question is assessments. I'm sure that's, well, by the sounds of where I joined in on the last conversation, that was a pretty big topic about assessments. So how will these look in the future? How can academic integrity be maintained? And what should be assessed? Secondly, we need to consider the many ways that AI can be utilized to support and enhance our learning. That was a pretty big takeaway from the conversation I've just had with the QAA Student Strategic Advisory Committee, is in what ways can we actually use these tools to speed up the learning process, to help students access material, to help students in their own self-directed learning. And finally, how will students be taught to make a proper use of these tools for maximum benefit and minimum risk? So starting off with the question around assessments and academic integrity. When it comes to assessments and coursework, I think that students need to have extremely clear boundaries set. These really do need to be like a line in the sand, especially in these early days, so that nobody accidentally falls foul of academic misconduct. It might also be the case that, well, really, it needs to be iterated quite clearly, despite current university policies technically covering a lot of the generative AI areas or having release policies. I think reminding students directly is an important thing to do, just to make things clear and let them know when they can and can't use these types of tools. I think some universities already have some sort of statements or rules on the use of AI, but making these rules explicit for students is really quite essential. And it should also be a conversation, not just shouting at students that these are really bad, you can't use them, you can't do this. Lots of no's are probably not going to be the best approach. I think this needs to be a discussion around what academic integrity is, why it's important, and the benefits of maintaining that academic integrity for the students themselves. So there are many features of ChatGPT that are not necessarily off limits as well. And I think these need to be addressed as to whether or not students can or can't use them, because some of them seem pretty similar to other technologies that are already widely used, such as Grammarly, which many students do currently use to review their own work. And ChatGPT can do very similar things, but because of its quite advanced language processing models, it can make more significant changes to the text that's inputted, potentially leading it away from the student's own work. Now, it's not always clear, I guess, for some, whether or not that is academic misconduct. So for for yourselves giving work and within institutions, I think we really need to make it very clear what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So making sure that students understand that it's really about that work originally being written by them and without significant alterations by AI. But again, maybe encouraging in some instances the use of these tools to proofread work or make these kinds of comments in the same way that students are already doing with tools like Grammarly. So it always helps to stress the importance of integrity and appeal to that moral level, but there may also be some concerns in students about falling behind if they're not using these tools, but they know their friends are. So that's another real concern, I think, that some students may find they may themselves not want to potentially fall into the trap of academic misconduct, but it is very tempting when you see that big red juicy apple of knowledge and wisdom, or apparent knowledge and wisdom, sitting right there and could potentially aid and benefit their own outcomes and give them that extra grade boost. Very tempting to use that. So I think we need to bear that in mind, and that also leads me on to something I'll discuss slightly later on about equity of access to these kinds of materials. So I think we're all fairly aware that detection of AI is not really very effective at the minute. It's not. I think Turnitin recently posted quite a reasonably effective determination of AI, but it seems like there might be many ways to actually get around that. And as the technology develops, it might be hard for the detection of that to really keep pace. So when it comes to the actual assessment process, it really might be time to have an inflection point and move away from, I guess, in many ways, some non-authentic methods of assessment. Those, I suppose, standardized academic tests where we all sit in a hall under time conditions and suddenly have to write lots of stuff down, or as many of us have moved away from that practice, going over to sort of assessments that can be done online or not in person, but then that opens up the possibility of using generative AI in order to help the students. But I think many students have appreciated that shift away from those traditional methods of examination and have broadly welcomed them. So there is a concern by many students that these new generative AI tools might force a shift back into this old style of exams out of a knee-jerk reaction. But I should hope most of us would agree that the standard academic examination is not really the best or most representative method of assessing student learning or skills. I myself, back when I was an undergraduate, I was very good at cramming in lots of information before an exam, and have had a relatively good short recall memory, so I was always fine with exams. But I never really found that they were a great way of actually assessing my understanding of content or material. It was more of a, could I cram everything in the week before and then spit it out on a page in perfect memory in response to a question. So really getting a better, more authentic idea of student learning will be, I think, a key development in the assessment field post this generative AI. I think it may also be very important to actually begin assessing students' own ability to use AI. I think it's going to be a really, really important skill in the workplace, something that's going to be very desirable in certain companies. So actually teaching students to use AI and then assessing their ability to do that, like we do currently with other tools such as Excel, or being able to use PowerPoint effectively, being able to process documents in Word. I think this new set of technology should also be treated in the same way, and we should start integrating the use of AI into assessments so that students can learn how to use these tools effectively, have feedback on their use of these tools, and how they can improve that in the future. So hopefully in the future we'll be seeing tests that actually use AI instead of trying to ban it. And I think students would really appreciate that as well, because that's going to help them gain competitive skills for a tough job market afterwards. Okay, so moving on to discuss some of the many positives around AI. There's actually another really great QAA webinar on this as well. It's how can we use AI for good? So AI can be a valuable tool for enhancing our learning. Tools such as ChatGPT allow for new ways for students to extend their learning outside of the classroom. AI tools can help with researching a topic that they need to, such as typical literature reviews. It's really great for providing really snapshot overviews of topics. We've recently held a PGR conference within my faculty, and there are lots of, as there was a faculty merger, we've now got people coming from psychology, and we have people coming from human and health and medicine backgrounds. So we have all these different people coming together, and sometimes I don't really understand their particular field or background. And I found that actually doing a quick overview on the Bing version of ChatGPT is a really great way to get a rough idea of their topic and their what they'll be talking about, so that I can engage with that material much more in the moment. So it's a really handy tool to be able to do that really quickly, instead of having to half pay attention to what they're saying whilst also trying to search away on the internet and read a few different sources so that I have some clue of what they're talking about. It's a really great way for discovering new areas of research. I find that if I haven't got much of an idea of how something currently works, as an example within my own research, there's some intonations that a kind of T cell that I'm interested in from very young babies might have different regenerative properties that they don't really share as adults, but I don't really know much about regenerative medicine in any way, shape, or form. And I didn't really know where to start in terms of the literature. And I found that using a ChatGPT-like model was actually really good for pointing me towards some great literature that's been able to get me into the field. And then from there, I've been able to explore on my own and discover new things. And then within reading those papers as well, sometimes you sit down with a big, long paper and, well, it can be daunting, or you just don't feel like you have the energy, or you don't have time right then and there. So it can be a very useful tool for very rapidly summarizing some of the key points from papers. I've had somewhat mixed success with this one, though, I'm not going to lie. It can sometimes make things up, this hallucination problem that these models do suffer from. So it's important that we are aware of these as well, and we'll come more to teaching about that in a minute. It's a great way for finding resources and to investigate new ideas. It's very useful for particularly niche topics, but again, that can be pretty hit or miss at times, especially if there's not much out there and it hasn't got much to base its generative models off of. Then it can sometimes come up with, especially the Bing version where it references where you get that material from. You follow through those references and you find that material didn't actually say anything like what ChatGPT has just said. So there's definitely some issues, but it can be a really great tool for being able to research faster and produce work faster. I also find it as a great way to check my understanding very rapidly. It's a bit like that Google box that appears suddenly now when you start searching things, and you'll get a bit more information. You can ask a question and might give you that information directly, pulling it from web sources. So it's essentially the same model, just on a smaller scale, but this at a much larger scale can deal with slightly more complex questions and give you more detail as well. So I found that as a really great way of using this tool, and also sometimes to double check my understanding. There's lots of information we have to keep in our heads. Sometimes a little bit fuzzy, and you can very quickly search this, and it can be easier than trawling through a bunch of papers to try and find that statement when it was used one time. I also like to use it as a way for generating new ideas. Actually, with this particular presentation, I was thinking about, well, what kind of things might it be interesting to talk about? And I thought, well, let's see what ChatGPT says. So it actually came up with some pretty interesting ideas talking about authentic assessment, some of the things that I'd already considered. I had some interesting ideas about communication and making sure that students were fully informed about academic integrity and so on. So sometimes it can be a great way to affirm the ideas you've already had, or possibly throw in a few new ones. So being able to brainstorm like that for students is going to be a very useful tool and help them in their own learning at home outside of the classroom. It can also proofread your work, which I think is a very interesting one, to help you see where you made mistakes. It can also help you rewrite that work in different styles. We can sometimes get very bogged down in our own particular way of writing, but sometimes that's just not appropriate for the audience. Some words that we might use in specialist fields, everyday language to us, but then try and translate that to somebody who's never heard of it and they're clueless. So it can help adjust your writing to make it more accessible to wider audiences. So it can be pretty useful like that. So leading on to the final part, which is really understanding how to use it and educating students on the potential pros and cons, I think it's really important to state that a tool is only as good as the hand that wields it. So really what students need is guidance on how to use these tools. They need to be taught about what kinds of dangers there are. and they need to be shown examples of the ways that they can use it to support their learning. So educators need to put in some guide rails and directions to help with that. I think there's been some efforts within my university already to do that, but I think that needs to be happening a little bit faster, because young people especially tend to be much quicker on the uptake of new technologies, and I think institutions are falling behind the pace at which students are actually starting to use these tools, but many students may be falling into the pitfalls that are inherent in generative AI models. So we really need to teach students how to spot them and how and where they can get around those kinds of pitfalls, because sometimes it can purely be based off of what types of prompts you might give the model at the beginning. Two prompts based around the same topic could get very different results of differing quality. So being able to use these kind of tools effectively is likely going to be, as I mentioned earlier, a really essential skill for job applications in the near future. It might even be that I can envision a future where jobs might be created purely around using AI, such as job titles like a prompt writer. I can quite easily see that being involved in future jobs. So much like we've made computer skills part of the curriculum, I think we need to start introducing AI tools as part of that curriculum as well. And I think students would expect to see that as well, to match their higher level of education, so that they're getting the very best and latest skills. Students will want to be prepared for the jobs that lie ahead, and many of those will be using AI, because companies are quite rapidly taking up this technology in order to increase the productivity of workers. I know we hear a lot about in the news, will AI replace jobs? And it probably will or might in some cases, but I think it's also likely just going to be a tool that's used to help massively increase the productivity of workers as well. So workers are going to need to be trained in these skills before they go into the job market. And I fear that those who are not AI literate, by the time they're finishing their education, may end up falling behind and might find it much harder to catch up and get those jobs, much like being tech illiterate in recent years has also been a severe handicap. So in order to do this, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we need to integrate AI tools into our normal workflows and teach students how to integrate them into their workflows. I think we need to think about coherent regulations across universities, coherent strategies between different teaching groups within our own universities. For example, within mine, some departments have very different policies already on the use of AI to others. I think one of the ones that stands out to me is, I think it's translation. They've noted that students already have started using this because it's a really fantastic way of translating material, but that's a real issue for them. Whereas in other departments, there is more of an approach of trying to get students to use it. So I think, but we need a more coherent response to that. So in the not too distant future, I think it will become a bread and butter. So we all need to be able to use it properly in the educational space. But for now, students will need a lot of guidance on how to use these tools safely and effectively. And second to last, really, moving on to a couple of concerns that have been raised in the last QAA meeting I just came from. We have the diversity of policy, which I kind of just mentioned. Within that meeting, we all shared some of our own universities' approaches to this, and it seems that some universities are taking a real hardline approach to the use of AI tools, whereas other universities were already considering how to educate students on the use of these tools, how to implement the use of these tools by staff, and how to educate students on the pitfalls and dangers of these tools as well. So that might lead to a massive problem in the future, with students from some universities gaining a really useful set of tools in the AI landscape, whereas students from other universities that have been more adverse to the adoption of this technology may not be competitive with their fellows despite having done the same degree. So I think that's something we really need to keep an eye on, and as educators, we need to be working on making sure that there is a coherent strategy to this. And the QAA itself has taken real note of this. At the moment, I think it's still very much in the scramble stage, and it's mostly trying to listen to various different groups about the best practices involved and considering then how that could be rolled out on a wider scale. Some of the other issues that were raised that I thought were particularly interesting were ideas of equity of access. So although some of these tools are currently free, it's quite likely that in the near future, especially the more advanced version of these tools, such as already now ChatGPT version 4, which allows you to view the sources, as an example, might be hidden behind paywalls. And other generative AI tools, other than just the natural language processing ones, may also be hidden behind pay tools, meaning that students from more affluent backgrounds potentially would have a real advantage, as they will be able to pay to use these tools. And we already know that within higher education, there is a stratification based off of affluency as well. And on the same sort of line as that, we have to consider how it might not always be as equally used by students from different nationalities. In some countries, they have already banned the use of these tools. So students coming to the UK from other countries may not have any experience in how to use these tools, whereas students here already seem to be using them quite rapidly and in some cases quite effectively. And if that trend continues in the near future, students coming from elsewhere may be seriously behind in terms of those tech-based skills. So we really might need to consider how we can level the playing field around equity of use and diversity of use amongst different student groups. And within that, there might need to be a consideration of provision of these software tools, much like Microsoft Office is a essential part of most universities nowadays, and they'll provide access to those resources for students so that nobody's really left out. I think we may need to consider doing something similar for generative AI so that we don't end up in a situation where some students miss out because they simply can't afford the latest and fanciest tools. So if you are looking for a little bit more information from the QAA, there are a couple of links here that I thought I'd share with you. There's two of the webinars that I've talked about. So how should assessments look like in a post-AI world? And the other one was how do I use AI as a force for good? Some really interesting points that are made in there. I'm sure many of you have probably already had a look at these before, but for those who haven't, there's some very interesting material about what are some of the pitfall traps? How can you learn to use generative AI tools better? What kind of prompts really work well? What kind of prompts have? What are the limitations of these prompts? And then finally, there's a document recently released by the QAA, which is focusing on how you can use the current frameworks and standards with some alterations to tackle the challenges around academic integrity and quality in the face of ChatGPT. So I think that really brings my presentation to an end, but I'm more than happy to discuss any points and take any questions. I'll hand over back to Nigel.
Thanks, Sean. That was a really great presentation. It's really nice to get a student perspective as well, and also some up-to-date feedback from the QAA. There's been some discussion in the chat about things like the return to in-person exams and whether or not we amend sort of online exams to make them more cheat-proof, which has been quite interesting. But one of the questions that came through from David was about how do we educate educators in the use of AI? Says everyone thinks they know how to do it and or isn't qualified to do it and will be forced to do it. So how do we sort of level the playing field, as it were, in terms of giving academics the skills that they need in order to be able to advise students the best? You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I think this, well, it's going to be a challenging one because most of us don't really know how these models work. I have a little bit of a background in some very basic machine learning models, and it's given me some understanding. But these kinds of generative AI models are extremely complex and very hard to understand. But I think there is a way forward, much like we had with COVID. It was a very sudden step change in how we delivered education, and many institutions started appointing somebody in a sort of digital learning space, and there was a head for digital learning or some sort of equivalent. So that person would be hopefully well informed on the topic, be liaising with other universities on the topic, be liaising with quality bodies such as the QAA or OFS in England now on that kind of topic. So I think a similar model could be adopted here as well, where you have heads or digital heads or AI heads who are actually well informed on that area and can then from a top-down approach begin that education process, putting out guidance and setting those guardrails.
It's an interesting idea there. I mean, the thing, as a digital education lead for the school I work in, the field is moving in such a rapid pace, and you're getting sort of 20, 30 new tools being released every single week. How on earth do you keep on top of all of those and siphon out the ones that are going to be useful? I mean, just this week I came across one which will convert an audio file into a 3D image that you can put into Blender for a virtual environment. You know, the whole thing has just exploded in terms of what people are doing and using this for. It's going to be a really interesting challenge to see as academics whether we can filter out those ones that are going to be useful. And if you have played around with anything that you think might be moving that way, and it's a more academic side of the sort of Gen AI rather than just ChatGPT.
Me myself, I have not actually used that many sources. I've been a bit bland, I guess. I've mostly just been using the ChatGPT version of Bing to really help me with searches and so on. And then I forget the name of one, but there's one which also helps you look for research papers and follow up with sources. But yeah, I fully understand. This is an extremely rapidly moving environment. I think, well, I'm nowhere near old enough to remember when the internet in the early 2000s really became, I guess, a big phenomenon. But I imagine it's probably somewhat similar to how that would have disrupted and shifted education, because that field developed so rapidly and so quickly. So maybe there are some lessons to be learned from how people dealt with those changes.
It may well be. You're not old enough to remember the joys of dial-up internet and sort of having to get off the phone line because your dad needed to make a phone call. There's been an interesting comment from Nia in the chat about universities providing very diverse outcomes for the same degree anyway. Do you think it's a risk that in the future students will select a university based on their policies to AI? So are universities that embrace AI likely to see an upshift in number of applications from students, do you think?
I think that is a potential. I think it's much like when we go around, or when students are coming around currently, like as I've worked as a student ambassador for quite a long time, and many of the students are quite interested in what kind of technology is available and usable for the students. What's the latest and greatest tech that they have access to? What are the library facilities like and the computer facilities like in the lab? What's the best things that they can use there? So I think institutions that are leading on AI technologies may well garner more attention than institutions that try to shun it. But I also think that there may be concern among students. This really came up in the last meeting I just came from, about how educators themselves are going to be using AI. Students have raised concerns about what guidance are they getting and what guidance is there for educators using AI for marking. It might be a quite tempting tool to pop your 150 essays through ChatGPT to gain some marking advice or feedback, but is that going to be beneficial for the student? What guidance do staff have on being able to use these kinds of tools? Just like students will need guidance on how they can use these tools to write their essays in the first place. So I think if there's not clear communication on how these tools are also being used by staff, or if it seems like the whole education field is shifting to removing staff from the equation and just using AI as much as possible, I think that might also be a concern for students.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, the feedback aspect of it, I think it depends on what you want to use it for. So I had a conversation with a colleague a couple of weeks ago who uses reflection in there as a part of an assessment, and said that one of the things that she struggles with is the subjectivity of the marking, and was wondering whether something like ChatGPT would completely remove that subjectivity from it if they fed them a decent rubric, which is quite an interesting concept to be considering.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I think having recently done a lot of marking myself, sometimes I do question about, when I get halfway through and I've got a bit fed up, am I being as, lenient or as harsh as I was at the beginning? So it may even help with things like consistency. But again, I feel that students might be concerned that their work is, instead of being seen by a real human, is actually just going to some machine that will do it really rapidly instead. So I guess currently also applying for new jobs, and sometimes you hear that company will pass, the hundreds of CVs they get through into some computer system to evaluate them first, and then you have to know how to tailor that for a computer to analyze rather than a human to analyze.
Yeah. Liz has asked, do you think that the students who engage in these conversations are self-selecting for the digitally confident ones? So is there sort of a risk that there's bias being induced into the discussions already because the people that are involved are more digitally literate or confident in their skills?
Yeah, that's a risk. And I think, someone from Keele University at the meeting I just came from pointed out that within their university they have a lot of more mature students for which the uptake of new technologies, we all know, is a little bit slower. So they're less likely to be using these tools, less likely to be talking about these tools, and might not be entering the conversation as much as people who are really enthusiastic about them. On the flip side to that, I also think that it is a lot of young people who might be concerned about the use of these tools. So although we are enthusiastic about potentially using them in order to help our own research and development and education, I think there is also a certain phobia within that because of dangers of, in the back of our minds, we've all got that little voice saying we'll be replaced eventually by AI, or that we're never going to interact with a human in our education system because educators will be replaced by AI.
It's quite interesting you say that, because given that you didn't listen to Liz's talk, if you were in the QAA meeting, she raised some similar concerns in terms of the students' sort of engagement with it. So it's quite interesting parallels there.